Okay, this evening, before we start with our program, we have some business to conduct. We would like to make some changes in the bylaws. The one you just got today, I don't know how many of you have read your newsletter. I think some of you got it today anyway. And in that was a change. We also had one from the previous newsletter, and we would like to vote on them. Is there anyone who objects to voting on the one that was just in this last time because you didn't really have a chance to think about it? I will read what they both are. The first one is from Article 4, Section 3. It presently reads, "An officer who has been elected for 2 consecutive terms shall not be nominated to the same office unless 1 year elapses between the end of his last term and the beginning of the term for which he is nominated." We would like it to read this way. An officer who has been elected for 2 consecutive terms shall not be nominated to the same office unless 1 year elapses between the end of his last term and the beginning of the term for which he is nominated, except the secretary and the treasurer. The terms of officers in these positions shall be terminated at the request of the individual holding the position or by majority vote of the Derry Township Historical Society Board. The reason we'd like to change this is because it's very difficult to find good people to do treasury work and also to do secretarial type things. The treasury, it would be very difficult to move every 2 years because different people would have to handle the books. So we would like to make that change. You can think about that one because I think that's the one that was out in this newsletter. The other one also deals with the treasurer. The second one reads this way now. The treasurer shall be responsible for the safekeeping of funds and for maintaining financial records. The treasurer shall deposit all monies received with the financial institution in the name of the society. Money shall be paid out by numbered checks signed by the treasurer and the president. The treasurer shall render a report at the annual meeting. An audit of the financial records shall be conducted by an audit committee appointed by the president. The change we would like to make is this. We would like to remove the section dealing with the audit as it is stated now. In other words, the part that says an audit of the financial records shall be conducted by an audit committee appointed by the president. We want to delete that and change it to this. The board of directors shall vote annually to determine if an audit shall be performed by an independent third party. Majority vote is required. An audit must also be conducted in any year in which at least 40% of the general membership petitions the board of directors. If an audit is not voted on by the board of directors or the general membership, the president shall appoint a 3-member committee to review the financial records on an annual basis. Those are our 2 changes. Does anyone have any thing that they would like to say about either one of those?
I make a motion we accept the recommendations of the board on both of them and pass it.
Do I have a second? Who seconded it? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? All right, we will change those bylaws then. Okay, on then with our program. Is Marilyn here? Maybe you would like to tell them a bit about our raffle tonight before this will be done at the end.
Good evening, everybody. We have 3 items this evening to raffle off. One is priceless for a New York Giants fan. Quarterback Dave Brown, courtesy of our friend Ernie Corsi, I'm sure, has autographed a football for us to raffle off. We also have a 1-month membership in the Coco Court and 2 tickets to any Bears game this season. So we sell our tickets for $2 each or 3 for $5. And I imagine we'll be selling them and doing this after the program.
After the program.
Right?
Okay, our Vice President, Bunny Blanco, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kathy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? I'm not used to speaking into a mic. It is my. Do I? Okay. Is this okay? Is this all right? Can you hear me now? Okay. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce to you this evening our speaker, Dr. Joseph Breckbill. I'm sure most of you know Dr. Breckbill, who is the curator of the Milton Hershey School's historical section. And Dr. Breckbill has been associated with the Milton Hershey School for 35 years. Dr. Breckbill had attended the Messiah Academy, after which he graduated from Lebanon Valley College with a major in history. He then went on to Penn State University, where he got his master's and his doctorate in education. As I said, he has been associated for 35 years with the Milton Hershey School. He has also, in the last 4 years, done a narrative, or is working on a narrative, of the school, and which is going to be included in his presentation this evening, the early days of the Milton Hershey School. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Breckbill. Thank you.
I don't know whether I should use this. I'm afraid if I put it over my head, I'm going to mess up what hair I have.
I have a comb. It's blow dry.
Can you hear me without it? You want me to use it?
Yes.
The presentation is going to be a little bit different than what was advertised. I've had a lot of trouble with this one. In fact, I had 3 different programs I was going to give you tonight. But the slides that I had, and that I had, I left them at home on purpose because I didn't want to change my mind after I got here. There's so much to cover, I feel a little bit like Burt Reynolds. You know that song in The Bandit? I have so far to go, but so little time to get there. You remember the song? That's a little the way I feel tonight. I have about 25 minutes of history that I'd like to give you. It's probably a little bit different type of history than what you would expect for the early days, because I would like to talk more about the people than I would about buildings or things like that. And so after about 25 minutes, I'm going to open it up for some questions you may have. And then after that, I have a treat for you. A couple of years ago, we found some very rare film over at the archives at the school. It's about 50, maybe a little more years old, but the film had shrunk. And so when I tried to get it transferred to video, they said they couldn't do it. But through Watermark Video, some of you know Skip Clamp, we were able to find a place down in Memphis, Tennessee, which put it in solution, and inch by inch, they expanded it. We don't have any video, we don't have any audio with it, but we do have the pictures. And some of these pictures are of the Rose Garden. Some of them are of the community. Some of them are early pictures of boys in the school. And some pictures, it looks to me a little bit like a promotional that Hershey had at one time. I don't know who the lady is. Maybe some of you can identify her. And also an actor, it looks like an actor, and they were riding around on a boat on the Swati and different places. I think you'll enjoy that. That's about 15 minutes long. And according to my mathematics, that brings us up to about an hour, and I don't think you want to sit any longer than that. Tonight I'd like to share with you some thoughts about the early days of the school that we call today the Milton Hershey School. My remarks are not so much on buildings and events, but on people. In addition to having been associated with the school for about 35 years, I, along with you, come from a family background that is very similar to the Hersheys. In fact, my own family left Switzerland around the same time that the Hersheys did, and went to the Planentine area of Germany, where they lived until the early 1700s. However, it was not until the mid-1700s that the Hershey family moved to the Derry area. And I apologize for following my notes rather closely, because if I don't, I'm going to get off on a tangent, because there's so much here to share with you about the background of the school. Nothing ever happens in a vacuum. That is, as far as human events are concerned. If we want to understand the school today, we must have some understanding about the times and the people who brought that school into being. So, travel with me back to Switzerland in the 16th and 17th centuries. Switzerland became divided religiously. The Reformation was in process. Luther in Germany had led a movement asking for reform in the church. And this spilled over into other areas of Europe. Others picked up the cause. In Switzerland, we find Zwingli, who was one of the principal players, resulting in most of Switzerland becoming Protestant. And by the mid-1600s, in this area, the Hersheys came with many families who had come under the influence of the teaching of a Catholic priest from the Netherlands. And this Catholic priest was Menno Simon. Among other things, he preached nonviolence. Around 1670, a call went out from the cantons in Switzerland for men to join the army. When there was passive resistance among the followers of Menno Simon, and there was much persecution. It was during this period that many families fled to Germany, as well as to other areas. But our interest this evening are on those that went to the Planetine area and later came to this country. Now let's jump ahead to Derry Township, before the Hershey families moved here in the mid-1700s, from what I call the lower part of Lancaster County. The year is 1742. It is 34 years before the Declaration of Independence. An Englishman by the name of William Morrison obtained a warrant on 157 acres of land in a new township in Lancaster County called Derry. Derry Township having been established in 1729. That would be 100 years before the birth of Milton's father. But we are getting ahead of the story. There were Scotch-Irish in the area who were mostly frontiersmen. Derry Church had been in operation since 1724. But they kept moving west. They had cleared some land, but for the most part the land was still heavily treed, and there were Indians remaining in the area. However, the infamous walking agreement had removed most of them west of the Susquehanna. There were some Indian raids from the north during the French and Indian War, but for the most part the area around here was safe to homestead. It is reported that the last massacre of settlers took place in an area at a place called Sinor, which is located just northeast of Old Forge Acres, which is north of Palmyra. 4 members of a family of 7 were killed by a raiding party from the north. It was on this land that William Morrison owned that the homestead was later built. William sold that land, and there were many names on the deeds over the years. Some of them you may recognize. Names like Stoney, Fishburne, Clark, Marr, Duckles, Percy, Huffman, and others. And then there was Peter Eberly. Peter bought up a number of parcels until the total number of acres that he owned was 351 1/4 acres. It was this land that Isaac and Anna Hershey bought in 1796 for 4,041 Pennsylvania pounds. Assuming a pound at that time was worth $5, the cost per acre would be about $70 an acre. Almost 30 years later, Isaac and Anna, who were living at the old homestead behind the present Reformed Mennonite Church off Bachmanville Road, decided to build a stone farmhouse on the property for their son Jacob, who was about to be married to Nancy Hershey. Jacob was 24 years old, and Nancy was 18 years of age. The stone farmhouse was built in 1826. There is no record of Isaac and Anna ever living at the homestead. Jacob and Nancy moved into the farmhouse, and 3 years later, in 1829, the first of 7 children were born. They named him Henry. Henry would become the father of Milton. In 1831, Isaac transfers ownership of the farm to his son Jacob. We don't know a whole lot about the family life Henry lived at the homestead. However, we can draw some conclusions. It was a Mennonite family. And as such, at that time, education was looked on with suspicion, and with good reason from their experiences in Europe. However, we know that Henry's brother Joseph became a physician, and Elias, a teacher at the Derry one-room schoolhouse, had Milton as a student. Henry appears to be smart enough to become anything he wanted to be. He was interested in everything, and he questioned everything. But he was never able to put it all together. We have no proof of this. But as one interested in personalities of people, I suspect that Henry may have been spoiled by his father. He was the oldest, and he was bright. Things came to him easily. Many times, such children early in life, when not sufficiently challenged, get into the habit of thinking they can do almost anything without too much effort. At any rate, Henry lives at home. He loves to read. He loved to debate. He loved to innovate, usually with the idea of doing things around the place with less effort. He was not much help at farming. However, he had many ideas about how others should farm. He fitted the definition of a critic, one who knows where we are going, but has no idea how to get there. In 1856, when Henry was 28 years of age, he married a girl from Lancaster County by the name of Veronica Buckwalter Snavely, called Fanny. Fanny is 21 years old, and in the fall of 1857, their first child is born, and they named him Milton. And he was born at the homestead. How many people were living at the homestead at the time, we're not sure. Of Henry's siblings, if they were living, Isaac would have been 10, Elias 15, Jacob would have been 18, Christian would have been 20, Elizabeth would have been 24, and Joseph would have been 26. It was the usual practice then that the oldest son would get the homestead. However, in 1860, Henry decides to sell the place and he moves to Campbelltown. Anna dies the following year, and Henry remains in Lebanon County until he dies in 1877. Henry was in no position to buy the farm, so they move out and live at different places in Derry Township before moving to 9 Points in Lancaster County in 1866. In 1862, Serena is born, Milton's only sibling. She dies before she was 5 years of age of typhoid fever and is buried in her mother's family plot in the New Danville Cemetery near Millersville. Meanwhile, in Jamestown, New York, a family of Irish immigrants who came to this country to escape the Great Potato Famine have a little girl who will play a major role in the Milton Hershey School story. Catherine Sweeney is born. And there's an interesting story about her name, Catherine. All during the time that she was living, and articles appeared in the Hershey Press, her name was spelled with an A. Even on the deed of trust which established the school, it's spelled with an A. But Milton evidently spelled it with an E, because I went to the cemetery to see what was on her at the cemetery, and it's spelled Catherine. But in all the other documents, it was A. Catherine is born in 1871, 2 days after Independence Day. She loved music and had a personality which attracted friends. It is doubtful that Catherine's education went beyond 8th grade, as we have not been able to locate any school records beyond that point. However, in studying the postcards she would send to Mother Hershey when she went to Europe, we do know that she had a good command of the language and could write well. The story is that Milton met Catherine on a business trip to Jamestown. But we're not so sure about that. However, we do know that she worked in a store in New York, and Milton would take frequent trips to New York, and they courted there. On May the 25th, 1898, they were married in a private ceremony in St. Patrick's Cathedral Rectory by Father Murphy. Milton brought his bride back to Lancaster to live with him in the house that he had been living in with his mother. Everyone was happy to meet Catherine, except possibly Mother Hershey, who did not like the looks of this fashionable gal from the city. This was 2 years before they sold the caramel factory. Catherine was very interested in meeting the employees of Milton's at the caramel factory, which held about 400 employees at this time. And so do you know what he did? He had a big chicken corn soup supper for all the employees. And that is the way he introduced his wife, his new wife, to his employees. In the fall of 1896, Milton bought back the homestead, which now was owned by Levi Gingrey, Henry's son. But Levi had gotten so far in debt that he had to sell off parts of the farm to raise cash. Finally, he put the farm up for sale, which now only had 36 acres to it. This was in September of 1896. It would be the following April before the deed could be registered in the courthouse. Milton paid $10,310.69 for the property, which evidently was the encumbrance on the property. After Milton's father died in 1905, Milton and Catherine moved into the homestead while their new home is being built in Imboden's Woods. In 1908, they would move out of the homestead and into High Point. The new home would cost around $34,000. There is no question about the fact that Milton and Catherine's marriage was a good marriage. However, within a few years after they were married, Catherine began to experience health problems. They soon realized that they would not be able to have children of their own. Especially Catherine wanted a family of her own. Before they moved out of the homestead, there must have been many conversations about the subject of family. Their personal lawyer and friend was asked to look into the matter and began work on a document we all know now as the deed of trust. Portions of this deed were taken from similar documents, especially the Girard Trust. Milton visited there on a number of occasions while the deed was being written. The homestead would be used as the first school building. And there were some features in the deed which some people have found hard to understand. However, let's look at the background. Catherine, as a Catholic, Milton, coming from a Mennonite background. Therefore, when they got to that point in the deed of trust where they wanted to be sure about religion, that it would be non-denominational, there are additional reasons, some of them coming from stories handed down from one generation to another within the family. But probably none was more important than the conflict that Milton had experienced in his own home between his mother and father on the subject of religion. Milton did not want that conflict in his own family, which he and Catherine were creating with this document. There's ample evidence to support this view. In the late spring of 1809, Milton employs George Copenhaver to be superintendent of farms. George comes from Berrysburg in Upper Dauphin County. George Copenhaver and his wife had been trained as teachers in the seminary at Berrysburg. He had taught for several years there and had gone to Philadelphia, where he taught for a period of 6 years. And before coming, he taught for a period of 6 years in the public schools. It was during this time that their only child was born, Dan. But George and Prudence did not feel that the city was the place to raise a child. So they decided to move back to the country. They moved to Mifflinburg, where he became superintendent of the Wilson Farms. Mr. Wilson was an attorney for the Pennsylvania Railroad. However, George was not sure what he wanted to do with his life. He considered the ministry, he considered farming, but he loved teaching and working with children above everything else. However, in those days, he did not feel he could support a family on the pay of the rural school board. was able to pay a teacher. One evening, he was reading in the classified section of a Harrisburg paper about Milton Hershey needing a superintendent of farms. He answered the ad. MS got the letter while on a trip in the New England states. He asked his friend and confidant, William Leadkicker, to go up to Mifflinburg to see if this fellow was worth talking to. Well, all of this happened before Milton and Catherine signed the deed. Leadkicker came back with the story that this fellow was somebody that Milton ought to talk to. And so George and Prudence Copenhaver came down here to Hershey, Derry to Derry, and talked to Milton. Milton offered him the job practically on the spot and wanted an answer from George, which George gave before he left and went back. It is interesting to note that the Hersheys chose to sign their deed of trust in New York City. Lawyer Snyder was in Lancaster. Why did they choose New York? It is true that they were leaving for a trip to Europe in a very short while, but I suspect that they wanted to sign the deed of trust, which created the school, in the town which held many happy memories for them. The Copenhavers moved into the homestead after the Hersheys had moved out in 1908, when they went over to High Point. And it became their home, the school's home and the school's first classroom. It would be September 1910 before the first students were to arrive at the homestead. Prudence Copenhaver was to run the home and would also substitute as a teacher during the first 2 years as George had duties with the farms. In 1909, when George was hired, Milton had four farms and 144 milking cows supplying milk to the factory. George Copenhaver and Prudence Copenhaver had more to do with setting up the home school than anyone else, including the Hersheys. That is because the Hersheys were in agreement with what they were doing. Milton and Catherine held them in high esteem, as is evidenced by their later actions and remarks on the part of the Hersheys. Even when George died in 1938, Milton, even though when George died in 1938, Milton did not attend the funeral. Milton did not attend the funeral because he was in the hospital. Having fallen on some ice, broke 2 ribs. Prudence was very concerned about where she was going to live. After all, they had lived there since 1909. And George died in 38, and she was concerned about where she was going to live. And then M.S. Hershey did something that I think is very typical of M.S. Hershey. He deeded the homestead to Prudence Copenhaver for the rest of her natural life, so that she didn't need to worry about where she was going to be living. That is something that I think is very typical and insightful as far as Milton Hershey is concerned. What was the school like in those very first days? There are several things you should keep in mind. The students during that very first year were all from the 3 surrounding counties of Dauphin, Lebanon, and Lancaster. Well, the 3 counties, only 2 surrounding. They were all aged 4 to 8 years. They were all indentured to the school until they were 18. There were no intelligence tests. They had to have a father deceased. They had to be white boys. In effect, they became Mr. Hershey's boys to raise. The boy's mother could see what was happening, but for the most part, would not interfere. These were his boys, and it was his family. It would seem that he was impatient to teach them how to make things. The first students made some of their own furniture for their rooms. They would take and make some of their own toys. The boys were 9 and 10 years of age. When their boys were 9 to 10 years of age, they were taught metalworking and woodworking. Mr. Hershey seemed to feel that the only reason for going to school was to learn a skill to make a living. He did not rule out book learning, but to him there had been too much emphasis in educating people to go to college. And Mr. Hershey is quoted in the Hershey Press in the early days of the school, expressing himself on that point. Vocational education in this period of time, and up to about 1925, was really an apprenticeship program. He believed strongly that a boy should be allowed to follow his interests and to develop his abilities to the fullest extent possible. In those early days of the school, he even had George enroll boys in correspondence courses, if no one could be found to teach a subject or a skill that the boy wanted to learn. Here are the actual words of Arthur Whiteman to what his experiences were as a student. This was written when Arthur was 16 years of age. He had been enrolled at the age of 4. Arthur impressed Mr. Hershey, as Mr. Hershey would later select him to work in the trust company. And Arthur would become president of that trust company before his retirement in 1974. This is Arthur speaking. From the time I entered the school, the only things we had to do was eat 3 square meals a day, play and sleep. We had a big lawn, a big playhouse, an orchard, and a playroom at the main. The latter we used when it was too cold to go outside the playhouse and in case of bad weather. We had all the toys that we needed to make us happy. They were furnished by Mr. Hershey, who is the founder of the Hershey Industrial School. At the age of 6, I spent my first day in school. We had the nicest schoolroom that I have yet seen. Each summer, as we grow older, we were taught all about truck farming. The truck gardens are useful for 2 purposes. First, the crops are used to feed about 175 children and about 50 grown people. Secondly, they furnish all the experience necessary for anybody who wishes to take up that kind of work. Everybody has a chance at this level of work. All the young plants and flowers are started in our greenhouse. This greenhouse is under the expert care of a gardener hired for that purpose. Many people from the town start their gardens from plants attained at the industrial school. We are taught different trades at the institution. One summer we spent in painting. We painted all but a few buildings that are under the care of the industrial school. Our reward was the knowledge that we gained and a camping trip to Laurel Dam. Last summer we took up the carpenter trade under the instruction of Mr. J.K. Putnam, who at one time had charge of all the carpenters working for Mr. Hershey. All the buildings that we need repairing are fixed up by our carpenters. About 2 years ago, a group of our boys put a new base in the barn at one of Mr. Hershey's farms. After that was finished, they painted several of the buildings. Another trade taught to the older boys here is welding. Under the instruction of an expert welder from the Hershey Chocolate Company, they progress very rapidly. When a boy reaches the age of 18, he is given money, clothes, and a good job. And together with these and the training received at the Hershey Industrial School, they are sure of succeeding in life. I was given a position at the trust company to learn that business. When I am 18 years of age, I will have it pretty well learned and will be able to hold down a good position in any office. All the credit for the existence and condition must be given to Mr. Hershey, his mother, Mr. Copenhaver, who is our superintendent, and the others in charge of the institution. Mr. Whiteman wrote this when he was 16 years of age. The year was 1925. The impressions of his first years in the school are quite clear. They are the impressions he had of his training at the upper level. In his entire account, there is no mention of his academic studies. It is clear that the emphasis, as far as Arthur was concerned, was on the trade education which he received. And Mr. Hershey then had handpicked him to learn the office work in the trust company and gave him a job there when he was 16, actually 16. He gave him a job when he was actually 16. Didn't wait till he was 18. There are many side stories that we could tell as I've read down through that narrative with you, but I was afraid to keep you here for 2 hours. The story of Catherine, I think, needs an entire program devoted to it, about her role in the development of the school. But the point that I'd like to make is that the Hersheys, in my opinion, created the Milton Hershey School because they wanted to have a family. And those boys that were enrolled in the school actually became their family. Mr. Hershey, on many occasions, would go out to the homestead and take the boys in his car and take them for a ride. And they would go up sometimes as far as Rockville Bridge. He enjoyed being with them. And in many ways, he was like a boy himself when he was with them. Catherine, of course, didn't live very long. Well, as far as the history of the school goes, because she died in 1915. And a couple of years even before that, she was an invalid. We do have about 2 pictures, that's about all, of her with the boys. And this would always be up at High Point at their home. But Milton always said that the school was Catherine's idea. And I think what he meant by that was that it was Catherine's idea in the fact that she wanted a family. And Milton found a way, through creating the school, of providing her with that family. This would take us up to about the year 1920. Around 1920, things start to change out at the school, because it is about that time that the boys are getting older. Up to this time, they had not gone out to the farms, and Mr. Hershey couldn't quite decide exactly what he wanted to do as far as the boys getting older, what he was going to do with them. He and Mr. Copenhaver had decided a long time ago that there was going to be nothing in the school done that didn't have a purpose. And these boys had been enrolled between the ages of 4 and 8, were now getting older. And so he came across the idea of placing them on the farms. That happened in 1929. However, it's interesting to note that by 1915, Mr. Hershey had over 50 farms. He had 4 back in 1908, but he had 50 by 1915. The job for Mr. Copenhaver, who had been hired as superintendent of farms and then became involved with the educational program, got to be a pretty heavy load. And so around 1916, Mr. Hershey hired what he called a general superintendent. I don't know how many of you have heard the name of Mr. Signor. Mr. Signor came from a school down around Spring Grove. And he only was here for about 9 months, which I thought was interesting because we had a recent person that was here at the school for about 9 months, that you all know about. But anyway, in 1916, Mr. Hershey had all the employees of the school meet, and where he introduced Mr. Signor, and he considered it a very important meeting because he delayed going down to Cuba for 2 days in order that he could attend the meeting. And at this meeting that Mr. Hershey made one of his longest speeches. And in the speech he was appealing to the people. Basically, he stressed the word cooperation. He said anything can be done if we all cooperate together. And he wanted them to cooperate and work together for the boys in the school. This was the pitch that was made. And it was at this meeting that Mr. Snyder then gets up and says that all the farms were going to become part of the school. And Mr. Signor was going to be the general superintendent. Well, there are many stories of what happened after that. Many stories about Mr. Signor and the pumpkin seed. I don't have the story all straight myself, but evidently Mr. Signor had decided that one way to make the farms productive was to raise pumpkins. And so I forget how many hundreds of pounds of pumpkin seeds he got and planted pumpkins around the place. Well, mysteriously, by April of 1917, Mr. Signor resigned. The official record is that his resignation was accepted with regret, but we're not altogether exactly sure about that. We do know this, that George Copenhaver was very happy, because now he instead of reporting again to a person other than Mr. Hershey or Mr. Ledkicker, he could go back to the way things were done before, because Mr. Signor had come in as a general superintendent, and Mr. Copenhaver was having to report to Mr. Signor instead of to Mr. Hershey. So here we've gone on this long, and I'm just getting started. Do any of you have any questions you'd like to ask?
I have a comment. First, you knew I would say something. My mother was hired from the Harrisburg Academy by Mr. Copenhagen to come down here and work with the boys.
Okay. I
And
didn't know
since
that.
she wasn't married, Mr. and Mrs. Copenhagen decided to make a match. And the match she made, he came on a motorcycle. And my mother told me more than once, I told your father, he will, if he wants to go with me, he will not come on a motorcycle. So the next time he come back in a Model T or whatever it was, some kind of pure sack. My mother called it a pure sack, but it wasn't. But Mr. Copenhagen was a superman. And I give him the credit for putting my mom and dad together.
Oh, that's great. Mr. Copenhaver was a super person.
He was.
I have in the records over at the school letters that he would write to the boys and to their mothers, particularly about something good. You know, so many times we only write letters when something's bad or some complaint. But he would write letters telling the mothers how good their boys were doing. And the Paul Core, you remember Paul Core? There's a letter to Paul Core congratulating him on the kind of student that he was and the contribution he was making at the school, even while he was a student. These kinds of things. Also, following up with Mr. Copenhaver, another individual that wrote a lot of letters to the boys when the Second World War was going on was Mr. Hammond. We have many copies of those, of letters that he wrote to the boys and bringing them up to date on letters that he would get from other fellows and telling them what the latest news was and where the boys were and things like that were very, very meaningful. But it was a family. It was truly a family. And people that have not really been associated with the school don't really appreciate that fact, I fear. It's because you see the Hersheys created a home, and then they did homeschooling. If you really look at it, it was homeschooling, and that grew. And in fact, Mr. Hershey said, if I ever have 100 boys, I'll think that I'm very successful. Well, of course, we all know that during his lifetime that we had 1,000 that were here. So early on, Mr. Copenhaver and Prudence needed help, and they outgrew the homestead, which the boys had referred to as the big house. At least that's what the old grads tell me, that they used to call it the big house. And but Mr. and Mrs. Copenhaver were really special. And Mr. Copenhaver, there needs to be a whole program done sometime on Mr. Copenhaver to really do justice to the contribution. I'll just tell you this little story. You know, this central campus idea is not new. 1920, we had a central campus. Mr. Copenhaver was from the classical school, more or less the old Latin school orientation. Mr. Hershey was over here. He was very practical. And of course, the two of them had differences of opinion all along on how the boys were to be educated. Mr. Hershey was educating Mr. Copenhaver, and Mr. Copenhaver was educating Mr. Hershey about how things should be. But both of them agreed on this, that the big cities were the root of a lot of our social ills. And the place to raise a boy was in the country. And it wasn't that he expected them to be farmers or anything like that, but there were so many things to be learned in the rural arts that couldn't be learned anywhere else, that were so important to living life. And I think that those of us that come from farm backgrounds or you know about the farm work, know that you learn a lot of things on a farm. You learn all about the cycle of life. You learn all about mechanical things. You learn about cooperation. You learn about nature. You learn about everything there is to know about to live. And of course, Mr. Hershey saw the rural setting, the opportunity of putting them out on farms, the opportunity of having them experience working together, how to accept the authority of an unreasonable boss, and do those things that you don't want to do but have to be done. And you know, there's a lot of those things. I remember very well of thinking how nice it would be to live in the city so that I wouldn't have to get up in the morning. Remember that?
Get up early and milk the cow.
Anyway, the central campus. There was a discussion between Mr. Hershey and Mr. Copenhagen about this business of housing. The Hersheys wanted the individuality of the boy protected. They went to great lengths. They didn't want them to be dressed in uniforms. They didn't want them to be lost in the crowd, so to speak. Copenhagen, all the private schools at that time, had dormitories. And it was really the economical way to do things. And in the early days of the school, I can understand because money was short. After all, up till 1918, Mr. Hershey was paying for the expenses of his school out of his pocket like a father would pay for a family. And sometimes there were things that they needed that they didn't get because there wasn't any money available at that particular time. Miss Beam, who was over at the school, related the story about telling MS that they needed books in the library because he had renovated the main in 1916 and made a dining room there and a central kitchen, and there was also some room for the boys up on the second floor, and there was also a little library, but the library didn't have any books. And he told her that, well, in time, it'll just take a little time. And then a little later, another teacher said, well, we need a high school. Now, this is a quote from MS. MS said, my boys don't need a high school. I didn't have a high school, and they don't need one. Well, we know he changed his mind a little bit about that later on, and so on. But I suspect the reason he said it was because he didn't have money to build a high school at that time. But anyway, there came a little test between MS, at least I call it a test, when Ivanhoe was built in 1920. Many of you remember Ivanhoe. It was the first building, but you know something else? It's the only building that was ever built on the Milton Hershey School campus with a classical name. Ivanhoe. And it was sort of a mixture between a dormitory and not a dormitory. They didn't have big bays like they have down at Girard College, but they did have 4 boys to a room. And they had double-decker beds. But that's the only building that was ever built like that. And Catherine was very much against it. And Milton evidently saw enough of it. And of course, with all these farms he bought, with all these good farmhouses that were out there that he saw potential in converting them into student homes. That was the end of that. But Ivanhoe was sort of a test case, in my opinion. I never realized this, but you know, a lot of school districts around the area were taking lessons from what MS was doing. We all know about the consolidation and so on. My very first job, back 10 years ago, was at a place in South Londonderry Township where they had a consolidated school. I was principal of that school, and I was always fascinated by the one room that you could open up, had folding doors. And you could open these folding doors up and make like an assembly room out of it. I never thought too much of it, where that idea came from. But you know where they got the idea? There happened to be a fellow on the school board over there by the name of Herbie Stroud. Staub? You know, I think he worked here at the school.
Yes, he was a house father.
He was a house father, but he was also, well, anyway, he was on the school board over at South London.
Right.
And I often wondered whether Herbie had anything to do with that idea coming over there when they built that school. Because that school building over there had been built about 1936. And Ivanhoe was built in 20. But there were a lot of ideas that came out of things they were doing here at the school that influenced surrounding school districts. So I know I'd get off. Any other questions? Very interesting story. Yes?
What about the farm situation? How many farms are in Hershey School now?
I really don't know.
Well, they do rent them, don't they?
The operation of the farms was turned over to the trust company. It's the trust company that is now handling all that business. But the total acres that are owned by the trust company remains fairly constant. It's up 9,000 acres.
They're diminishing.
They're diminishing little by little. Yes.
They are renting them, though, right?
Yes, it's my understanding that they're renting them. As far as the program at the school presently, they're doing a lot of things with 4-H and like planning things and learning. I really am not really up to date on what's going on presently. Yes.
Joe, could you share with us any insight you have on the impact of the Christian religion on Mr. Hershey and Mrs. Hershey? Did either of them practice? Did they?
Well,
did Catherine practice as a Catholic, for example?
yes. Yes, and although Milton never officially joined the church, in my opinion, both of them were very religious people. And Mr. Hershey had some ideas that maybe came from his father. I don't know. You know, his father, someone said that his father could have been a minister in his own church. The only thing was that a lot of the ideas he had didn't quite meet the approval of churches that were around. He had different ideas about things. But he knew his Bible. He knew his Bible. And of course, you know, MS was very interested in all Christians getting together and worshiping together. And they made an offer to the community here about building a central cathedral for everyone. Of course, that didn't go. But he ends up giving money to each one of the churches. But Catherine was a practicing Catholic, and she also got involved with Christian Science in the days when she was really struggling with her physical condition and things like that. But she always remained a Catholic, and she remained a member of the Catholic Church at her death. Milton, the story is that a pastor came to Milton one time and asked Milton what he believed. And Milton said, well, I believe in the Golden Rule and the Ten Commandments. And this, I think he was a Mennonite minister or something, and the minister said, well, Well, that's not gonna be good enough to get you into heaven. And Milton is reported to reply, well, it's gonna have to do. But Milton, if you take it, Milton was concerned. Both he and Catherine were concerned that the religious training and education of their students be properly looked after. And that's mentioned almost verbatim in that way in the deed of trust. And as you know, Copenhagen was a Lutheran, very staunch Lutheran. And the worship service we had over at the school was very much patterned after that, and remained that way for a very long time. I was very, very interested and happy in many ways to see the recent statement that came out at the school about religion. You know, there for a period of time when we had some lawyer in town, I forget what his name was, who interpreted the deed of trust where it says that it shall be non-sectarian. He interpreted that as meaning non-sectarian. Many of us, well, for years over at the school, we interpret that as meaning basically Christian but non-denominational. And recently they came out with a religious statement that says that's the official adopted policy approved by the Board of Managers, that we're a Christian school but non-denominational, which I thought was a significant thing to get into writing. I don't think Milton Hershey would have tried to force his religion on anybody, or would want somebody else to try and force what they believed on somebody else. I think that possibly that comes from some of his father's influence, and possibly some of his own thinking. In that area, he was I don't want to say broad-minded. He had a bigger view than a lot of people did at that particular time. I'll put it that way.
You know, the first board of trustees had Reverend John D. Curry on it.
That's right. He had a beard.
Yes.
And he wore a plain coat.
Yeah.
I want to mention that I caddied for Mr. Copenhagen a number of times.
Really?
He was a fair tipper and a below average golfer.
I can relate to that. The poor golfer. Well, yes.
There's another gentleman in this room and myself. Where the gazebos are, we pick tomatoes there. Because we worked in the duck patches on both sides of the road for Milton Hershey School. They're just two young kids, and the rest were old buzzards. They got $1 an hour, and we got 35 cents, 30 or 35. And we worked rings around them, planting celery and doing all kinds of work. And then one day they decided it was time to pick the tomatoes. Now there was tomatoes from the road that goes back to Founders Hall all the way up to the hospital. And you know the big trees that were between the highway and now Founders Hall. Well, these boys from the truck patches over along Airport Road, they decided to see if they could hit the trees with the tomatoes. And Dr. Lewis and I said, let's get out of here. And we went across the street. And in about a half an hour, they all got fired and sent home except Dr. Lewis and I.
There's one last story I want to tell you before we get to the video. You know, after Catherine died, if you look at the pictures of Milton Hershey, you see a difference in the man. It's almost as if, and in many ways did, the light went out. And this goes on to about 1928, 29, when Milton actually had entered into an agreement to sell the corporation. They were going to form a holding company with Phoenix Cheese Company, and Palmolive Pete was in it somehow. And this was through the a big New York bank was going to bankroll the thing, and Milton was going to get $50 million immediately out of it, which he said would enable him to do a lot of things at the school for his family. And then October comes of 1929, and lawyer Snyder had a little line in this agreement that said that if the economic conditions would be such, that so on, well, it was the out. And it seems like at that point that the deal fell through. But anyway, at that point, it seems like Milton all of a sudden woke up and decided to take this thing by his own hands and start moving with it. And from that point on, we see a different Milton. But we almost this community would be much, much different than it is today if it wouldn't have been for lawyer Snyder's little line in that agreement. And this is well documented. And Milton said later, he's not sure about whether it was a good thing for the school, but he knows it was one of the best things that ever happened for the community, that deal fell through. But Milton was not one that was afraid. It's interesting about him. Partly his Mennonite background, in some ways he was very conservative. In some ways, he never wanted to be on the stage. He never enjoyed getting up in front and talking to people. He didn't want the limelight. He did a lot of things. He always did it, so people wouldn't see it and wouldn't find out about it, like giving the $60 million. In 1918, he never found out about it in 1924. He didn't want people to know. In some ways, he was that way. But in other ways, he was very aggressive and very assertive, as my wife would say. My wife says she's not aggressive, she's just assertive. Well, I can testify to that. But anyway, I often, you look at some of these things that are recorded in a person's life just like your own, where things have happened. Some of it you planned, but a lot of it you didn't. And you look back at your own life when you were, let's say, 18 years of age, how many of you thought you'd be doing what you did or are doing now in your lifetime? And I really believe that God used a fellow like Milton Hershey and had a lot more to do with directing his life than what a lot of people think. Just like I think God has a lot more to do with directing our lives than we think. Yeah, but when we stop and look back at a lot of things, we can see where there must have been a guardian angel up there that was pushing you in the way that you should go. And there was sometimes through our own stubbornness that we made some mistakes that maybe we could have avoided. I don't know. Well, we're going to see this video. This video cost me a lot of money. There's a little bit of video you're going to see. You're going to see it fast. You have to look fast. We can't stop it. But this little bit of video, I'll just share this with you, that you're going to see cost over $2,000 to put on video from the film. That's how important it is to have your films and your negatives and your photographs and things in acid-free containers in a humidity-controlled environment, because if you don't, it's going to deteriorate just like you and I did. It's just part of it. But we hope you enjoy this, and if you can see some things in there that you can identify that we haven't identified, maybe after it's over, you can let me know what it is. All right? May the technician come forward. have double like that.
Understand, wasn't that the same thing over?
I believe. The first part of the homestead, which was stone, was built for $850.21.
Brisk walk.
Yeah. Now, that's John Daniel, I think. Does anyone know what this is?
There's my brother-in-law.
Who is it?
My brother-in-law is right there. You can just see inside of him.
John Sullenberg. John Sullenberg.
I thought maybe this might have been Dutch days or something.
I'm getting Dutch made in the back, I thought.
That's Charlie Walker.
Where's that?
I think it's just a model.
That's Daniel.
Oh, it's got candles in it.
That's Whitmer.
That was the model for the arena. There's my brother-in-law, Jim. He was president of the Rotary up here.
Anybody know those men?
George Barlow.
George Barlow.
Goodness, Harris there.
We were out of the color cartridge.
Oh. Now, who is she?
That's the same.
Yeah. Joe, do you have a date on this? What year this was taken? There's thousands. Now, this is the one that intrigues me. This next one. Where is that? I don't know. I thought it might be over by the juvenile golf course. Not now. This is the one where it looks like they hired some professionals to come in and make this film.
Look back at the hotel.
That's the hotel.
Okay. That lady with the hat.
What year was that thing? No shrubbery. Baby elk. Yeah. Now there's a school board. Yeah. You'll see them again. The hotel. Now this lady with the hat really, she's really effective. Effective. You're right. Bring her in from the outside.
She wasn't around here, was she?
Look at this.
The hat finally blew off.
Hollywood. It's a genius.
Oh my, keep the camera on me. What's that, the golf course at the hotel?
That might be the old number 2 that went down by the tea house. Where the tea house used to be.
Now there evidently was audio with this.
Another 2000.
There she is again. There's the schoolboy.
You said they weren't supposed to look alike. When did it decide to make them all look alike?
That's Sunday.
On Sunday, you all looked alike.
Well, some have bow ties, some have long ties. Notice they're all orchestrated too. See how they started out there? Charlie, that's you down the corner there, isn't it?
Yeah. Hardly. We all have the same haircuts too. Although we like Dave, I did wear a knicker, same barber, you're right. Yeah. Oh, there's the reservoir for Drury Township.
That's Jack Daniels.
Very excited. Watch this. Watch you walk. Here she is again.
Is that on the squatting? That has to be on the squatting because that's the only place they have a motor boat. Nicola ride. Circle the dining room at the hotel. Whose house was that? Is that your house? Very good.
Looks like she has something on her trousers.
She came with an elephant.
I know three medicines too. Oh my.
Either the first tee.
Well, I think that's about it. I want to thank you for being such an attentive group. As I said, it was very difficult because there's so much to tell, and there's so little time to tell it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Breck. Now, wait, just a little thank you for you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
I need a microphone. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
No, I just wanted to remind them of our next program, November 20th. It will be Bill Studenroth with his Hershey Treasures and our special guest, Mr. Monroe Stover. Hi, Mr. Stover. See you back there. Yay. He'll be with us next month, so tell your friends and family to come and we're going to tell stories and have a good time.
Okay, I think that was a most interesting presentation, thank you. And I think that maybe since he has other installments, that we ought to have him back again to give some more of his installments. Okay, Marilyn, I think we're ready for the raffle then. As soon as the raffle is complete, we do have some refreshments in the back we'd like you all to enjoy. And